bombshell, and I think certainly it's true in the moment.
I thought that was just such a disgrace. I thought she behaved so badly and harried. She is a person who controls the narrative.
There are moments when silence stops being calm and starts feeling heavy. This was one of them.
Until now, there was a lot we didn't know about just how the seventh in line to the British throne came into this world. In his newly obtained birth certificate, it shows
Prince Harry has spent years telling the world that honesty matters more than tradition, that secrecy is harmful, that truth, even when painful, is the only way forward. And yet, when one question emerged that could have put every rumor to rest, he did not answer it. He avoided it. Then Tom Bower began circling the subject. Not loudly, not recklessly. He didn't accuse anyone of anything. He did something far more unsettling. He suggested the truth was no longer emotional or symbolic, it was factual, biological, and provable. Because when questions about parentage enter a royal story, they don't behave like gossip. They behave like pressure, cracked slow at first, invisible, but spreading. This is not a story about scandal. It is a story about hesitation, about why the simplest proof was never offered, and about what it does to a man when doubt touches the one thing he was supposed to be certain of. Once that doubt exists, it does not go away. It waits. Every royal story begins long before the public ever notices it. It begins in corridors, in briefing rooms, in quiet exchanges between people whose job is not to feel, but to foresee. And in the autumn, before Archie's birth, something subtle but unsettling began to ripple through those corridors. At Buckingham Palace, the machinery of preparation was already moving. The due date had been broadly communicated. Security plans were drafted. Communications teams prepared statements modeled on decades of precedent. At Kensington Palace, advisors expected the usual choreography to follow, named doctors, a confirmed hospital, a signed notice. The system had never failed because it was never allowed to improvise. Then the details started slipping. The pregnancy announcement itself arrived without the usual medical framing. The hospital was not confirmed. Rumors circulated quietly about possible locations, first the Lindo Wing, then elsewhere, before settling vaguely on Portland Hospital. Even then, clarity never quite arrived. For palace staff trained to track precision, vagueness was not a stylistic choice. It was a warning sign. Inside the palace, this is where the first divisions formed. On one side were the modernizers' advisors aligned with Prince Harry, arguing that tradition could bend. Privacy mattered. Meghan's comfort mattered. This was a new era. They believed the public would accept reassurance in place of record. On the other side were the institutionalist senior advisors, protocol officers, legal advisors who had survived previous royal storms. Their concern was not Meghan Markle as a person, but Meghan Markle as a variable inside a system that depended on certainty. They asked simple questions. Who attended the birth? Where exactly did it take place? Why were signatures missing? Between these factions sat Meghan Markle, whose approach to public life had always been narrative first. Appearances were curated, messaging was emotional, timing was strategic. To her supporters, this was strength. To the institution, it was unfamiliar terrain. As the months passed, the pregnancy became more visible and, paradoxically, more confusing. Public appearances showed a changing silhouette that photographers struggled to reconcile from one event to the next. At an engagement in Birkenhead, then later at the Royal Albert Hall, commentators noticed differences that did not align neatly. Again, none of this proved anything, but it did something far more dangerous. It created a need for explanation. Inside palace offices, notes were made, not accusations. Observations. This was the moment. When Tom Bower began appearing in private conversations, not because he had published anything he had not, but because he was known for one habit that unnerved institutions, he noticed patterns and waited. Bower had spent years documenting how power reacts when its foundations are challenged, and according to those familiar with his thinking, he had begun asking questions that were procedural, not salacious. What happens, he asked quietly, when a royal birth does not close its own file? The birth announcement itself landed like a controlled explosion. It arrived in the early hours, carefully worded, conspicuously light on detail. No signed notice by attending doctors stood outside the palace gates. No medical names were confirmed. The public was told to accept the outcome without The process. Inside the palace, the reaction was immediate. The modernizers urged calm. They framed the omissions as evolution. The institutionalists were alarmed. One senior aide reportedly described the situation as unfinished business, because in royal terms, a birth without documentation is not modern. It is incomplete. This is where the stakes escalated. Once the question of documentation is raised, it does not stay academic, it becomes legal. Lineage is not symbolic. It determines titles, succession placement, and constitutional clarity. Quietly, legal advisors began mapping contingencies not because they believed wrongdoing had occurred, but because they could not prove that it had not. And that distinction mattered. Prince Harry, meanwhile, was under increasing strain. According to accounts close to the household, he went back and forth between defiance and worry. He bristled at questions, interpreting them as attacks. He defended Meghan fiercely, emotionally, personally, but emotion does not resolve institutional doubt. It inflames it. At the heart of the tension was one unspoken question. If everything was exactly as presented, why was the system being denied the very tools designed to protect it? This is where the antagonist of the story fully emerged, not a person, but a force. Narrative control versus institutional verification. Meghan's camp believed story was enough. The palace believed record was essential. Tom Bower, watching from the outside, did not accuse anyone of deception. What he did, according to those who have followed his work closely, was far more unsettling. He noted that when verification is avoided, it is rarely because it is impossible, it is because it is inconvenient. By the time Archie was presented to the world, the damage was already done, quietly and irreversibly. The palace had not unified around the story. It had split. Trust had fractured into factions. And once that happens inside a monarchy, the story no longer belongs to the people at its center. It belongs to the institution, and institutions do not forget unanswered questions. Once doubt entered the palace, it did not spread evenly. It moved along fault lines that already existed between emotion and procedure, between marriage and monarchy, between the story Harry wanted to believe and the system that demanded certainty. Behind the scenes, the pressure intensified. At Clarence House, senior advisors began asking questions that could no longer be postponed out publicly, not even formally, quietly. Requests for confirmation that should have been routine were met with delay. Delay turned into defensiveness. Defensiveness hardened into refusal. This was not how innocent confusion behaved. This was how risk behaved when it sensed exposure. The palace divided further. On one side, Harry's inner circle doubled down. They warned that any push for verification would be seen as betrayal, that questioning Meghan was equivalent to attacking her, that pressing for proof would hand victory to hostile media. They framed resistance as loyalty. On the other side were figures who had seen this movie before, senior advisors who remembered what happened when Prince Andrew's story collapsed. They knew one lesson above all others. Scandal survives headlines. It does not survive records. If proof exists, it ends speculation. If proof is withheld, speculation grows out of control. This is where the human drama reached its breaking point. According to accounts that later informed Tom Bower's thinking, Prince Harry began asking questions privately, not accusations. Questions. Why the birth documentation differed. Why doctors were unnamed. Why everything surrounding the pregnancy had been so tightly controlled. These were not the questions of a man seeking betrayal. They were the questions of a man trying to steady himself. The answer he reportedly received was not reassurance. It was fury. Meghan did not respond with calm explanation. She did not offer clarity. She reframed the questions as disloyalty, as weakness, as Harry allowing outside voices to poison his mind. The conversation shifted instantly from facts to feelings, from proof to pain. This is a powerful move in personal relationships. It is catastrophic inside institutions. Harry retreated on in that retreat. Something fundamental changed. Doubt that is spoken can sometimes be resolved. Doubt that is punished becomes permanent. This was the moment Tom Bower later described, indirectly, as the point of no return, it because he could prove anything definitive, but because behavior had crossed a threshold. Innocence does not fear verification. It demands it. It uses it as a weapon. Here, verification was treated as an existential threat. The idea of DNA proof hovered over everything like an unspoken ultimatum. It was never raised publicly, never demanded by the palace. But its absence became conspicuous. No court order was required. No public spectacle was needed. A private, independent confirmation would have closed the door forever. It never happened. Instead, what followed